it is great to be in Queensland. Those of you that are alert will know that NQA is North Queensland Airport. So I'm on the board of the privately held entity that operates Mackay and Cairns airports. And I think that's partly because back in the day, in the last century, I spent a couple of very happy years here in Brisbane as the zone chief manager for Queensland Country. So I've been to every little tiny town in Queensland, many of whom used to have a Westpac branch before I got there, including places like Boulia. But it was certainly a formative part of my career, getting out and about and seeing what Queensland was all about. So let me, before I get on to my comments in a spirited defence of business, given what we have heard over the last little bit, just acknowledge the Turrbal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Look, I'm very much personally committed to ensuring that CEDA, as the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, is about connecting economic development to as many people as possible. And I think that means taking a very careful lens on the impact on our First Nations people, who have often been, absent in the conversation and therefore left well behind. So let me talk first a little bit about CEDA, because it is my first opportunity to speak as CEDA's National Chairman. I'm really honoured to be Chairman in CEDA's 60th year. That actually makes CEDA and me almost the same age. And I'm going to leave it to you to decide who's the older one and who has weathered those 6 decades more gracefully. But I can look back with the benefit of what is now a 40-year business career. I can actually barely believe it. And I believe there has not been a time in CEDA's history when this organisation has been more needed than it actually is today. So why would I say this? Think about the last decade. We heard from Michael, the decade of distrust. We have seen a lot of politics, great for Peter, lots to talk about, but not a lot of policy. And we're so much in the age of Twitter, the age of fake news, and sadly, as Michael pointed out, that age of mistrust or distrust of all that is not just like me. So in Australia, like so many other places, the important policy issues are thrown in the corner and seen in the context of what one group or another or one sector stands to lose. So what CEDA is doing really matters in an environment like this. So what lessons can we learn from the fact that CEDA has managed to maintain relevance and reach over 6 decades? Firstly, it's about CEDA's ability to bring together the most diverse group of any think tank or peak body. Jared talked about this. It's our members. We can have real conversations on real information with members from every geography, every sector, every industry and every type of enterprise that is important in this country. And the members of our organisation are meaningful organisations. And they join because of our independence. Members don't arrive on the horse of self-interest because CEDA is non-partisan and CEDA will not push anyone's individual barrow. So sustainability over those 6 decades comes back to our members, what we choose to talk about when we're together and how we carry on the conversation. And I think we can role model for the nation. So we're uniquely qualified to convince the community that the benefits of economic growth are actually worth fighting for. It's a huge task to bring business, government, the community and academia together, but I think it's something that CEDA can do well and something CEDA's really ready to do. But CEDA is not just going to stand still because we have been around for 6 decades. So we've recognised that in today's environment we need to build our own data sources to ground our work well away from fake news. So we're not trying to overdo Edelman or anything like this. It's not going to be our role. But we did launch the Community Pulse in 2018 to get a better understanding of what community really cares about and make that a vital first step towards regaining some momentum for broad-based economic reform. We launched this pulse into a community that had experienced 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth. But we found that many Australians feel disconnected from that growth. We followed up in 2019 with a Company Pulse survey, where we found reinforcement of the commentary that the community expects business to focus on its performance across financial and social dimensions and to engage on policy issues relevant to both. So you can see that we saw some very different priorities expressed by business leaders and the general public that's shown up on the chart here. So you can see that business leaders, what should they be focusing on? Work-life balance and staff well-being, the top two priorities from the general public. An increasingly held community view that employees should be the most important stakeholder for large companies. But business leaders have a different view, that it's the customer who is the most important stakeholder. I must say I was very pleased that Jared pointed out that jobs today in Australia are safer. As Chair of Safe Work Australia, I am very proud of the way that business has worked with government in particular, and also with the union movement, to improve safety outcomes. On a per capita basis and hours work basis, we really are world leaders, but we still do have a couple of hundred fatalities every year, and that's just unacceptable. We all know one is unacceptable, but I was pleased, Jared, so thank you for pointing that out. So that's all about the well-being piece. But it has been very interesting to see that this year we have seen some different change in the way that Davos is thinking about the world. So the Davos Manifesto 2020 has been launched. It's the first time they've done a new manifesto, which is talking about the universal purpose of a company in the fourth industrial revolution. And you can see from the quote here, there is a question about who is actually managing the responsibility for taking account of disruption in the workforce. But what the Davos Manifesto is asking is to suggest that corporations must acknowledge and they must act in the interests of a set of stakeholders much broader than just those with a direct financial interest in the corporation's performance. Now, as a Wesfarmers director of more than a decade standing, I can attest to the fact that satisfactory shareholder returns is a valid purpose for a corporation, but really only if those returns are couched as sustainable returns and there's a well-developed approach to ensuring sustainability through meeting the needs of a broader stakeholder set. Now, of course, the best way that corporations can meet the needs of their employee stakeholders is by actually providing them a job. And I think CEDA has always known that economic development is rooted in the performance of the economy in delivering jobs, but meaningful, value-adding and sustainable jobs. And I think this is what business needs to focus on. But it is an area where our economy has gone pretty well. And so employment has increased by 1.4 million in the past 5 years, and that has allowed economic security for people through growing incomes, better health, better education, and frankly, just more Australians in jobs. Now, we know that there are challenges as the gig economy becomes a reality and people's work mode preference change, and in also keeping trust when the way we pay people has become so complicated, it seems that no company can get what actually should be a simple business as usual function right first time, every time. So I think that is to a degree what's behind the Edelman results. So when this Davos Manifesto then suggests that corporations are the ones who should take responsibility for managing the impact of disruption, you can see from my comments that I'm going to agree 100% with that statement, that this is the responsibility of the employer, with collaboration from employees and from their representatives, of course. And I think this was a topic of real debate in the CEDA Future of Work series, and I think that this Davos position has a great deal of support in Australian business circles. And jobs is really what it's all about. Jobs is a bipartisan priority, and it's... I interviewed the Leader of the Opposition on the CEDA stage in Perth late last year, in his first major speech after the election, and he talked about pretty much nothing but jobs. And the Federal Treasurer has a 5-year target to create 1.25 million new jobs, which would be an employment growth rate of just under 2%. Treasury's done some numbers that are showing that actually the growth rate is just over 2.1%. But the trick is, how does that growth in jobs actually turn into something that we can all recognise as economic development? That's a bit that's not happening at the moment. And those of you that were paying attention to Michael Blythe will understand what that's all about. But the Governor of the Reserve Bank made a press club speech recently and he addressed this. He said, 2019 household consumption increased by only about 1%. But he went on to say that the Australian population is growing at 1.5% a year. So a decline in per capita terms in consumption. And then in what was I thought, a bit of a masterful understatement, he said, this is a highly unusual outcome in an economy that has recorded the type of strong jobs growth we've experienced in Australia. It's interesting, the world is different. I think we're all seeing that these relationships that business people have thought would always hold are actually not holding as well. So why? And those of you who've heard me speak before will know that I always dig in with a bit of a gender lens. I talked about our Indigenous people as having been silent in conversation. Well, women aren't silent in the Australian conversation anymore, but for a long time we were. And I think that, I always want to look at jobs data because I do believe that equal access to equally paid employment is one of my personal key measures of whether we're getting anywhere on gender equity. And when we look at that data, we do see that there has been, quite some gender impacts, and the gender effect is a key reason that the very strong employment growth the RBA Governor is commenting on hasn't resulted in a lower unemployment rate. What he said quite crisply was strong demand for labour has been met with strong supply of labour. And then he went on to comment that the very large lift in participation, especially by women and older Australians, is what is increasing the labour supply. And this significant lift in female workforce participation has been one of, I think, the most significant and defining economic and social transformations seen in developed countries. Because women's workforce participation is now approaching that of men. And it begs the question, why we still don't see the necessary lift of women in top jobs, and that's a discussion for another day, of course, but I think many of you in the room would be really disappointed and surprised if I didn't actually make the point. But older men and women are also staying in the workforce at significantly higher rates, but the shift for women is the one that's particularly pronounced. And it's hard not to think that this might actually have something to do with the financial insecurity that's associated with intermittent participation during childbearing ages that ends up in lower superannuation. And I think those of you that are alert will also know that the largest growing homeless sector in the Australian community is women over 55 years of age. And I think that's something that is not too heartening. But increasingly, jobs growth, and this is really not a new thing, it's been going on really since the 80s, what's been going on with women's workforce participation and also where jobs growth is. It is in personal and caregiving services, roles that are traditionally female-dominated areas. And with disproportionate representation of women comes lower wages. This is a phenomenon that's very clear because you see it in industries. If they just start to become more populated by female workers, wages will actually start to become depressed. So we've got a real issue in business and in the community that we need to challenge and change the current value proposition for women who are occupying these roles. And not the least of that is going to be to build appropriate flexible working models to make these sorts of roles compatible with your own personal caring responsibilities. That comprise a lot of that unpaid work that Jared talked about that Australian women do in a disproportionately higher share than their male partners. So CEDA's had some really good conversations examining women in leadership and the future of work, and I think that's made some key contributions in identifying very good policy prescriptions and roadmaps for corporate action to address these issues. You know, I think, though, it's just not possible for anyone to discuss the economic and political environment in Australia in February 2020 without pausing for a moment on the topic of carbon, climate change and that absolutely awful spectre of Australia burning. I was away in January overseas, and the concern for Australia, for Australians, and for our wildlife was a constant theme as soon as people picked up on my accent. And that was really comforting, but it was also really confronting, given my view on the lack of a coherent, strategic and sustainable framework for managing immigration growth, population growth and settlement across Australia. The company pulse was really clear that everyone, business leaders, employees and the general public, see large corporations needing to do as much as they can to improve the environment across the board, not just focusing on improving their own environmental footprint, but across the board. And this was really marked for millennials. That's the lot born between 1981 and 1996, so now 24 to 39 years old. And they really do see that the environment should be the absolute number one priority for business. So I'm sure that the Community Pulse for 2020 will be very coloured by the experience of the bushfires and also by the effectiveness of the relief and reconstruction events. I'm concerned about the impact on momentum in agricultural export and also tourism. And I think Michael talked about 0.3% impact. And some people say, oh, that's insignificant. But I hope he made the case for you that that's not the case. And while government spending will fill the gap, I don't think averages are very helpful when you have an impacted community where residents might not have the appetite for starting again. So I do think there's a real role for CEDA in making sure that we can have some debate around the micro reconstruction challenge. Company Pulse made it very clear that there is broad-based support for corporate leaders to take positions and speak out on issues of national importance. We saw that we've got this trust deficit, but I think 50% of us believe that when business leaders speak out, they're advocating in the national interest, but that means that 50% of us think that they're not. So I think we are trained cynics, and the sad thing of that is I think we've got good reason to be cynics. We have been trained. So CEDA has got to be a big part of this conversation, and CEDA is nothing if not aligned, because I wanted to finish by putting up the policy stack, which Jared talked to you through. I must admit I'm a bit startled that I did manage to get to the end of a conversation about what we might do to connect more Australians with economic development without saying increase New Start and get rid of stamp duty and replace it with land tax. So I'll leave you with those two final thoughts. Thank you.